How does a man spend years earning trust, while quietly building a private world no one around him can even imagine? Not a man hiding in shadows, not a man already feared, a man admired, a man respected, a man whose life, from the outside, looks so clean, so disciplined, so complete, that suspicion almost feels insulting. That is what makes some offenders more frightening than monsters. Monsters are easy to reject, but a polished man, a successful man, a decorated man, he enters your mind differently. He does not arrive as danger. He arrives as certainty, as order, as structure, as proof that everything is exactly where it should be. And that is why this kind of case disturbs people on a level they struggle to explain. Because when violence hides inside chaos, the mind can still understand it. It can point and say, there it is. But when darkness grows inside control, inside routine, inside prestige, then something far more uncomfortable begins to unfold. You are forced to ask a question most people never want to ask. What if some of the most dangerous people are not the ones who fail to fit into society, but the ones who fit too perfectly? Tonight we step into the mind behind one of the coldest contradictions in modern criminal psychology, Colonel David Russell Williams, a man whose public life looked like discipline made human, and whose hidden life looked like appetite without a face. This is not just a story about status. It is a story about concealment, about what happens when a private obsession grows in total silence, protected by routine, fed by secrecy, and strengthened every single day by the one thing that should have stopped it: respect. Because some men do not hide despite their reputation. Some men learn how to hide inside it. And once that happens, the uniform is no longer just a symbol. It becomes a curtain. And behind that curtain, the mind can begin doing things the world never suspects, until the silence finally breaks. The first mistake people make in cases like David Russell Williams is believing that a hidden life must always leave visible damage around the edges. They expect disturbance to look disturbed. They expect deviance to leak through the face, the posture, the routine, the voice. They imagine that if a person carries something dark enough inside them, then somehow the outside must begin to rot too. But that is not how some minds work. Some minds do not collapse under contradiction. Some minds organize it. And once a person learns how to organize contradiction, he becomes much harder to read than people want to believe. That is where this chapter truly begins. Not with the crime, not with the exposure, but with the terrifying psychological possibility that a man can live two entirely different lives and keep both of them functioning. One life visible, one life buried, one life built for admiration, one life built for appetite. And the more polished the visible life becomes, the safer the buried one begins to feel. That is what makes high-status offenders so psychologically disturbing. Because they do not just hide behavior, they hide it behind credibility. And credibility is stronger than charm. Charm can win over a room. Credibility can silence doubt before it even forms. The moment society sees rank, order, discipline, and professional excellence, it begins making silent assumptions. This man is responsible. This man is controlled. This man is stable. This man belongs on the side of protection, not danger. Those assumptions are powerful because they feel rational. Most of the time they're useful. But in rare and deeply unsettling cases, they become the exact thing a hidden offender learns to exploit. Because if the world already sees you as disciplined, You do not need to convince people of your innocence every day. You simply need to remain consistent. That consistency becomes armor, and armor changes psychology. A man who believes he is well protected by his own image does not think the same way as a man who constantly fears being seen. He begins moving through life with a dangerous internal advantage, the confidence that even if suspicion ever brushed against him, it would probably slide away, not because he is innocent, but because he does not look like the kind of man people want to imagine as guilty. That distinction matters, because in criminal psychology, public image often does not just protect the offender socially. It begins protecting him psychologically too. He starts trusting the disguise. And once a hidden person starts trusting the disguise, the secret life becomes much bolder. This is why dual-life offenders often unsettle investigators, more than openly chaotic ones. A chaotic offender is difficult because of unpredictability, but a hidden offender is difficult because of structure. He is not falling apart. He is managing. He is scheduling. He is controlling. He is placing one world carefully beside another and making sure they never collide. That kind of mental separation is called compartmentalization. And in cases like this, it becomes almost architectural. One room contains rank, responsibility, routine, and public respect. Another room contains secrecy. Another contains fantasy. Another contains the private impulses the person knows cannot survive exposure. And over time, the person becomes fluent in moving between those rooms, without carrying too much of one into the other. That fluency is what people underestimate. They assume the contradiction would be unbearable, but for some offenders, the contradiction is not unbearable at all. It becomes efficient. That is the truly chilling part, because once the mind learns to separate morality from behavior, image from appetite, and public function from private compulsion, the hidden self no longer feels like a temporary glitch. It begins feeling like a second life with its own logic, its own rules, and its own rewards. And those rewards matter, because a hidden life is rarely sustained by secrecy alone. It is sustained by what secrecy protects. A compulsion, a fantasy, a ritual, a private thrill that begins feeding itself in silence. And silence is where dangerous things mature. Not everything dark announces itself loudly. Some darkness becomes stronger precisely because no one interrupts it. No one questions it. No one even imagines it clearly enough to challenge it. That is often how the hidden self evolves, not through dramatic collapse, but through repetition, private repetition. A behavior repeated quietly enough becomes familiar. A familiar behavior becomes easier to justify. And once the mind justifies what once felt forbidden, the private world starts settling in like a permanent tenant. That is what cases like Williams's force us to confront. Not just that a respected man can hide disturbing behavior, but that he can hide it so well that the public self begins looking less like a real identity and more like a carefully maintained perimeter. A wall, a shield, a perfect surface designed to make sure no one ever thinks to look beneath it. And the more impressive that surface becomes, the more impossible the truth begins to feel. That word, impossible, has protected more dangerous men than most people realize. Because the mind hates contradiction. It wants clean categories: good man, bad man, protector, predator, order, corruption. But reality, especially in criminal psychology, is rarely that generous. Some offenders are not split because they appear broken. They are split because they appear complete. And when a man looks complete enough, the world often stops asking questions. That silence becomes useful, then comforting, then intoxicating, because the hidden self begins learning something incredibly dangerous. You can keep this. You can protect this. You can continue becoming this, and still remain who they think you are. That lesson, once fully absorbed, changes everything. Because from that point onward, the person is no longer simply hiding impulses. He is living in partnership with them, feeding them while protecting them while appearing admirable. And that is the first real horror of David Russell Williams. Not only that he had a hidden life, but that the hidden life was growing beneath one of the safest looking surfaces imaginable. A life of discipline, a life of order, a life the public was trained to trust. And once a man learns that trust itself can be used as camouflage, the private darkness inside him no longer has to run. It can settle in, it can breathe, it can wait. And while the world keeps saluting the surface, something else underneath it begins getting stronger. If segment A was about the surface, the polished, disciplined, almost untouchable surface, then segment B is about what happens underneath it when secrecy stops being occasional and starts becoming structural. Because hidden behavior does not survive for long on impulse alone. It survives through systems, and that is what makes a man like Colonel David Russell Williams so psychologically disturbing. Not simply that he had a secret life, but that the secret life appears to have existed with the same cold organization that made the visible life look so respectable. That is where people often misunderstand dual lives. They imagine the hidden self as chaotic, sloppy, reckless, something messy that exists outside the person's real identity. But in many cases involving high-functioning offenders, the opposite is true. The hidden self is not disorder invading order. It is order serving disorder. That distinction changes everything. Because once a private compulsion becomes organized, it becomes sustainable. And once it becomes sustainable, it begins changing the person from the inside out, not always in visible ways, but in psychological ones. Their relationship to risk changes. Their relationship to privacy changes. Their relationship to other people changes. And most dangerously of all, their relationship to themselves changes. At first, many secret behaviors live in the mind as something separate, something the individual still thinks of as a hidden part, a private urge, a compartment they can visit and leave. But over time, if that behavior is fed repeatedly, it stops feeling like a compartment and starts feeling like an identity. That transition is critical, because the moment a person begins thinking, this is not just something I do, this is something I am, the behavior gains emotional permanence. It is no longer a temporary release, it becomes a private center of gravity. And private centers of gravity pull everything else around them. That is how the hidden life starts taking shape. Quietly. Systematically, almost invisibly. A lot of people assume deviance grows through emotional explosion, but some of the darkest compulsions grow through repetition, so calm that it barely feels dramatic at all. A thought revisited, a boundary crossed privately, a secret ritual repeated just enough times that the mind stops resisting it and starts normalizing it. That normalization is one of the most dangerous things the brain can do. Because the brain is designed to adapt. It adapts to environments, routines, fears, pleasures, and behaviors. What once felt shocking can eventually feel familiar. What once produced internal friction can begin feeling strangely ordinary. And once the hidden act becomes ordinary inside the mind, it becomes much easier to protect. That is where Williams's psychology becomes especially chilling. A man trained by structure, routine, and control is not likely to build a hidden life recklessly. He is far more likely to build it with caution, to contain it, to make it fit around the edges of his visible life in ways that reduce exposure and preserve stability. That means the hidden life is not just a secret. It becomes a managed environment, a private zone where the person can engage with forbidden urges while preserving the outer identity. That keeps suspicion low. And the more effectively that management works, the more psychologically dangerous it becomes. Because success breeds confidence. Not loud confidence, not theatrical arrogance, something colder than that, a silent, internal confidence. The kind that says, no one sees this, no one notices, no one is close. And once the mind starts receiving that message repeatedly, the hidden self begins changing shape. It stops feeling like something fragile and starts feeling like something protected. That sense of protection matters more than people realize. A hidden offender who still feels vulnerable may remain cautious, but a hidden offender who starts feeling protected by routine, by status, by image, and by secrecy begins to think differently. He begins to feel psychologically insulated from consequences. That insulation is not innocence. It is something more dangerous. It is the early architecture of entitlement. Entitlement does not always begin as arrogance in the obvious sense. Sometimes it begins as repeated, unchallenged access to a private world. The person starts believing that because they have not been stopped, they are somehow allowed to continue.
Not legally,
not morally, but emotionally. The mind begins writing itself a new rulebook. If I can keep this hidden, then I can keep doing it. If no one knows, then it does not disrupt the life that matters. If I remain disciplined, I remain safe. That is how a hidden life stops feeling risky and starts feeling sustainable. And once something feels sustainable, escalation becomes possible. This is one of the most important truths in criminal psychology. Secret compulsions rarely stay frozen forever. Not because every offender is inevitably explosive, but because repetition changes the nervous system. The emotional intensity that once came from the hidden act begins to dull over time. What was once enough starts feeling familiar. What was once thrilling begins losing voltage. And when a hidden act loses voltage, the mind starts seeking more. That more may begin subtly, a deeper level of intrusion, a stronger violation of boundaries, a more refined ritual, more risk, more secrecy, more psychological ownership of the hidden world. This is how dangerous behavior often evolves, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual threshold erosion. The threshold that once felt too extreme begins moving, then moving again, then moving again, until the person is no longer operating where they once began. This is what makes hidden deviance so deceptive from the outside. By the time anyone sees the visible consequences, the internal evolution may have been unfolding for years. The private self has already matured, already adapted, already learned how to survive. And that survival changes the emotional balance inside the person. The public life may still function perfectly. Work continues, routine continues, respect continues. But internally, something else is beginning to dominate attention. The hidden self becomes more emotionally alive than ordinary life. It begins carrying the charge, the tension, the anticipation. This is a critical point, because when the private world becomes more emotionally stimulating than the public one, the person begins protecting it more fiercely than anything else. That is when the visible life changes function. At first, the public identity is just a life the person happens to have. But later it becomes a defense mechanism, a camouflage system, a carefully maintained shell whose real purpose is no longer simply to live respectably, but to protect the secret engine underneath it. This inversion is one of the coldest things about high-status offenders. The medals, routines, competence, and calm exterior may still look admirable from the outside, but psychologically they begin serving another purpose entirely. They become tools of concealment. The cleaner the visible image becomes, the safer the hidden one feels. That creates a very dangerous loop. The stronger the public image, the bolder the private life. The bolder the private life, the more important the public image becomes. And the more important that image becomes, the more fiercely the person protects both worlds from collision. That is no longer having a secret. That is living inside a constructed split. And constructed splits are hard to break because both sides feed each other. The visible life gives cover. The hidden life gives stimulation. One protects, the other rewards. And once a man begins living off both at the same time, ordinary moral breaks often begin weakening in ways no one around him can easily detect. That is why dual-life offenders are so unsettling to study. Not because they are supernatural, not because they're impossible to understand, but because they reveal just how much of human behavior can be hidden beneath competence, structure, and respectability when secrecy is allowed to mature long enough. Williams's case forces us to confront something that many people instinctively resist, that a highly ordered life can become the perfect incubator for private corruption, not despite the discipline, but partly because of it. Discipline can suppress visibility. Routine can reduce scrutiny. Composure can delay suspicion. And if the hidden self learns to breathe comfortably inside those conditions, it does not need to panic. It only needs to continue, quietly, repeatedly, successfully. And once the mind fully realizes that it can continue without immediate consequence, a new and deeply dangerous belief starts taking root. I can keep both lives. I do not have to choose. I can remain this man in public, while becoming something else entirely in private. That belief is the beginning of psychological hardening. Because once someone stops feeling torn by contradiction and starts feeling empowered by it, the hidden life is no longer just surviving. It is stabilizing. And when private darkness becomes stable inside a respected life, it does not stay harmless for long. It starts wanting more room. By the time a hidden life becomes stable, it is no longer just a secret. It becomes a private atmosphere, a psychological climate. The person starts living inside even while the outside world sees none of it. And that is where the case of Colonel David Russell Williams becomes especially disturbing. Because once you move past the surface contradiction of respected officer versus hidden offender, you begin to see something much colder underneath it. A mind that may have learned to experience intrusion itself as emotional fuel. That is where viewerism enters this chapter, not as a shallow label, not as a sensational detail, but as a psychological mechanism. Because viewerism in its deeper criminal form is rarely just about seeing, it is about entering another person's world without permission, crossing into their private space while preserving one's own invisibility, taking access without relationship, taking proximity without consent, taking emotional charge without exposure. And that is what makes it so psychologically corrosive. Because hidden, intrusion gives the offender something that ordinary life often does not. A private sensation of asymmetrical power. The victim does not know. The world does not know. Only the offender knows. That imbalance becomes intoxicating, and for a highly compartmentalized mind, that intoxication can become incredibly difficult to abandon. This is why secret deviance often grows in silence, more aggressively than people imagine. It does not need witnesses to feel real. In fact, the absence of witnesses may be exactly what gives it its emotional voltage. The act becomes more charged because it belongs entirely to the hidden self. No negotiation, no accountability, no equal presence on the other side. Just access, just control, just the cold thrill of being somewhere. One does not belong and remaining psychologically untouched while doing it. That matters. Because once the mind begins linking excitement to invisible intrusion, the hidden act starts carrying more than simple gratification. It starts carrying meaning. And meaning is what deepens compulsion. The offender is no longer just repeating behavior because it feels stimulating. He is repeating it because it reinforces a private internal identity. The identity of the one who can cross boundaries and remain unseen. The one who can move through forbidden space without consequence. The one who can silently possess what was never offered. That is no longer just deviance. That is psychological ownership fantasy. And ownership fantasy is one of the darkest roots beneath voyeuristic pathology. Because the offender is not simply curious about another person's life. He is trying to convert their privacy into part of his own emotional world. He is trying to absorb what was never his to enter. That kind of thinking often reflects something deeper than desire. It reflects a profound disturbance in how the person relates to intimacy, power, and emotional access. Healthy intimacy requires mutuality. It requires being seen while also seeing. It requires risk, vulnerability, reciprocity, and respect for another person's boundaries as something real and meaningful. But a hidden offender, driven by voyeuristic control, often wants the emotional charge of closeness without any of those human requirements. He wants access without vulnerability, presence without permission, knowledge without relationship. He wants to be near another person's reality, while staying emotionally and morally outside of it. That is not connection. It is conquest in secret form. And because it happens privately, the offender can begin convincing himself that it is somehow less serious than overt violence or direct confrontation. This is another danger in the psychology of hidden escalation. The mind often minimizes what it can conceal. It tells itself that because no one is physically present in the moment, because no one immediately reacts, because the violation remains hidden, the act somehow exists in a lower moral category. But internally, the effect is often the opposite. The more the person gets away with hidden intrusion, the more deeply the nervous system begins associating secrecy with reward. And when secrecy becomes rewarding, the private self starts organizing itself around anticipation. Anticipation is critical here, because many compulsive hidden behaviors are not sustained only by the act itself. They are sustained by the ritual before it. The thinking, the planning, the emotional build-up, the private rehearsal, the thrill of nearing a boundary and imagining crossing it. That pre-act mental world can become incredibly powerful. In some offenders, it becomes stronger than ordinary life. Daily routine starts feeling flat. Public success starts feeling hollow. Real conversations lose emotional charge. Achievement, respect, and external order may still matter intellectually, but they no longer carry enough voltage emotionally. Meanwhile, the secret world does. It carries tension, risk, anticipation, private electricity. And when that hidden electricity begins outshining the rest of a person's life, something deeply dangerous happens. The offender starts needing the hidden world not just as a stimulation, but as psychological oxygen. That is where the compulsion starts hardening. Because now the private behavior is not just something he wants. It becomes something his nervous system begins expecting. A ritual of regulation, a hidden mechanism for feeling alive, a secret route out of emotional flatness. This is why high-functioning hidden offenders can appear so externally stable for so long. The public life remains disciplined because the private life is doing emotional work behind the scenes. It is feeding whatever hunger the visible life cannot satisfy. And that hunger is rarely just sexual in the simplistic sense people assume. It may involve control. It may involve trespass. It may involve domination through invisibility. It may involve the intoxicating belief that one can quietly override another person's world while remaining socially untouched. That last piece, remaining untouched, is psychologically enormous. Because the hidden offender is not only violating a boundary, he is teaching himself something each time he succeeds. I can do this and still remain who I appear to be. I can enter forbidden space and return unchanged in the eyes of others. I can feed this private self without losing the public one. That lesson is addictive. Not just the act. The lesson, because once the mind starts believing it can maintain both identities indefinitely, fear begins shrinking, and when fear shrinks, boldness grows. Not always in dramatic leaps, often in small, almost invisible increments. A little more risk, a little more intrusion, a little less hesitation, a little more entitlement. This is how escalation often happens in disciplined offenders. Not through emotional explosion, but through repeated reinforcement of invisible success each time the person crosses a line without immediate consequence. The internal boundary shifts. What once felt forbidden becomes manageable. What once felt dangerous becomes operational. And once something becomes operational, it can be built into the architecture of the person's life. And that is what makes this chapter so psychologically important. Because David Russell Williams is not frightening only as a contradiction between public honor and private darkness. He is frightening because he represents what can happen when a hidden, compulsive world becomes so normalized inside the self that it starts functioning like a second bloodstream, moving silently beneath the visible body, carrying urges, rituals, fantasies, and violations no one else can see. The public life still walks, still speaks, still commands respect, still looks composed, but underneath it, another system is circulating entirely. And that system is not fed by applause, achievement, or responsibility. It is fed by secrecy, fed by intrusion, fed by the cold thrill of being somewhere he should never be and taken from it something he was never meant to have. That is where viewerism stops being a detail and becomes a window into the entire hidden architecture of the offender's mind, because it reveals a man who may not have needed chaos to feel powerful. He may only have needed invisibility. And invisibility, once it starts rewarding the mind deeply enough, can become one of the most dangerous drugs an offender ever learns to trust. Because once a person begins feeding on what remains unseen, the question is no longer whether he has a hidden life. The question becomes, how much of his real emotional life is now hidden? And if the answer is most of it, then the public man. The world keeps trusting may no longer be the real center of the personality at all. He may only be the shell that keeps the private engine running. And when the private engine keeps running long enough, it does not stay still. It starts demanding expansion. Every hidden world eventually reaches the point where secrecy alone is no longer enough. That is the final psychological shift. The point where concealment stops being just protection and starts becoming part of the offender's identity, part of the gratification, part of the private mythology. He tells himself about who he is and what he can get away with, and once a man reaches that point, he is no longer simply carrying a secret life. He is living inside a belief, a dangerous one, the belief that he can remain two people forever, that he can keep the admired surface and the private darkness at the same time, that he can keep moving through the world as a symbol of control, while another version of him feeds quietly underneath it. And that is where the psychology of Colonel David Russell Williams becomes especially haunting, because by the time the contradiction is finally exposed, the real horror is not only what was hidden, it is how long the hidden self was allowed to grow without resistance. That matters more than people think, because hidden deviance is not static. It does not remain emotionally neutral. It evolves in the same way all repeated behavior evolves. It becomes more integrated, more justified, more protective, and often more central to the person's internal life. The private self begins hardening around it. Moral friction weakens. Internal objections fade. The person stops experiencing the secret as something unstable and starts experiencing it as something earned. That is a deeply dangerous development, because once someone starts feeling psychologically entitled to their hidden world, they stop relating to it like a shameful behavior and start relating to it like a possession, something they have built, something they have protected, something they deserve to keep. And the more effort they invest in protecting it, the more emotionally attached they become to its survival. This is how the hidden life transforms from compulsion into territory. A private territory the offender begins defending with increasing intensity. That defense may not always look dramatic from the outside. It may appear as composure, routine, tight control, the continued maintenance of public respectability. But underneath that surface, a more serious psychological process may be unfolding. The visible life is no longer just a life. It is a perimeter around the secret self. That is one of the coldest truths in dual life psychology. At first, the hidden self must work around the public identity. But over time, if the secret world grows strong enough, the public identity begins working for it. Every sign of competence, every display of control, every symbol of respectability becomes useful, not because it reflects integrity, but because it helps keep the hidden life alive. This is where authority becomes especially important, because authority does something uniquely powerful in the psychology of concealment. It reduces scrutiny before scrutiny even begins. People do not question authority as easily as they question ambiguity. A respected title, a disciplined demeanor, a life built around order, these things create a kind of social gravity. They pull suspicion away. They encourage the mind to search for innocent explanation before dangerous ones. That does not mean authority causes hidden deviance, but it can absolutely protect it. And once an offender begins sensing that protection, the effect can become psychologically intoxicating. He starts feeling insulated, buffered, covered not just by his own self-control, but by the assumptions of everyone around him. That is a terrifying place for a hidden mind to arrive, because once someone feels protected by institutional credibility, the fear that normally limits behavior can begin to collapse. He no longer feels like a man sneaking through darkness. He begins feeling like a man who has solved the problem of being seen. That feeling changes everything, because fear of detection is often the last active brake in a hidden offender. When that brake weakens, escalation becomes far easier. Not necessarily immediate, not necessarily theatrical, but psychologically, the structure changes. The person begins thinking less in terms of, can I keep this hidden? And more in terms of, how far can this go before anything truly threatens me? That is a catastrophic shift, because once the hidden self begins asking that question, it is no longer just feeding on secrecy, it is feeding on invulnerability fantasy. The fantasy that one is too controlled to unravel, too credible to collapse, too respected to be fully imagined as dangerous. And if you listen closely, that fantasy contains something even darker underneath it, a private sense of superiority. The belief that other people are easier to manage than they realize, that institutions are easier to move through than they appear, that appearances can be engineered, protected, and weaponized if one is disciplined enough. This is what makes underestimated offenders so psychologically threatening. Not only what they hide, but what they begin learning about human trust while hiding it. They learn how quickly people relax around structure, how easily respect silences doubt, how often routine substitutes for moral certainty in the minds of others. And once a hidden offender learns those lessons deeply enough, he is no longer just exploiting opportunity, he is exploiting perception itself. That is why cases like Williams's leave such a lasting impact. They do not merely disturb because of the private behavior or the contradiction between image and reality. They disturb because they reveal how vulnerable social trust becomes when it attaches too strongly to surface order. We want discipline to mean safety. We want achievement to mean inner control. We want rank, reputation, and professionalism to carry moral reassurance. And most of the time, those associations help life function. But cases like this rip through that comfort. They force a harsher truth into view. A person can be highly controlled without being morally whole. A person can appear deeply respectable, while privately feeding something corrosive. A person can move through the world as a protector, while quietly building a self that has already defected from the values the role is supposed to represent. That is not simply hypocrisy. It is a split of identity so severe that one life begins consuming the meaning of the other. And by the end, that is what makes David Russell Williams such a chilling case study in criminal psychology. Not only the secrecy, not only the status, not only the hidden compulsions, but the terrifying efficiency of the disguise. A life so polished it could absorb suspicion. A public image so disciplined it could delay reality. A private world so protected it had time to mature in darkness. And that is what people often misunderstand about hidden offenders. They are not always discovered at the beginning of who they are. They are often discovered late, after the hidden self has already been rehearsed, reinforced, normalized, and emotionally integrated over time. By the time the truth finally breaks through, the offender is not merely someone who made bad choices in secret. He may have already built an entire internal ecosystem around those choices. An ecosystem fed by control, fed by privacy, fed by entitlement, fed by the thrilling an increasingly dangerous lesson that the world still sees him as safe. And once a man fully learns that lesson, the hidden self becomes extraordinarily difficult to interrupt, not because it is stronger than reality, but because it has already learned how to hide inside reality's most trusted shapes. That is the true horror of this chapter. Not just the darkness existed behind the uniform, but that the uniform itself became part of the darkness's survival. A curtain, a shield, a social permission slip no one knew they were handing over, and behind that shield, the private mind kept evolving, quietly, methodically, without noise, without visible collapse, until one day the world finally saw what had been growing there all along. And by then, the most frightening realization was no longer what kind of man he really was. It was this: how long he had already known.